Good evening, Bible scholars. Thank you so very much for studying the Bible with me this evening. We're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Genesis 4, I guess if we had a title for this, we might think about calling it The Seed Line Started. Much of the book of Genesis, especially from this point on and even before this point, deals with Christ and the seed promise. Remember Genesis 3 verse 15, Christ was mentioned. And so much of Genesis, of course, really all of Genesis in part has to do with this seed promise of how Christ came to this world and how God shaped the world, if you will, to the seed line so that it could be kept pure, if you will, so that Christ could come to this earth to save humanity. And the Bible is about God and man. Genesis 4 verse 1. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. And she bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Now, I think this is interesting in that we find here, was man eating just fruits at this point, or was he eating animals already? Of course, there's a strong conclusion here, of course, that they were doing both, right? And, if man wasn't eating meat, he was sure using animals, sheep. Verse 3, and in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. So Cain was a religious man, and he was partially obeying God. He wanted to please God, of course. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. Interesting. Now notice here that it doesn't say, at least here, that God was displeased with Cain. It's just that God was pleased with Abel. In vain did Cain worship God, didn't he? He was trying to do something, I guess, to please God. He made a great effort to please God, but he wasn't even acknowledged. God's ear is not too short that he can't hear us. Remember when Isaiah talks about how that God doesn't hear the prayers because their sins stand between them and God. It's not that God can't hear our prayers if we're in sin or sinners, or if we're not Christians, if we haven't been obedient to God. It's just that he won't. And I guess there's a point in time when certainly God would be angry if we worshiped inappropriately, offering human sacrifices, for example. That would be very displeasing to God. But here, at least at first, we find out that God doesn't say anything to Cain. God isn't pleased with Cain. It's interesting how that man wants to please God. Abel, he brought up the firstlings of his flock and the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering. But to Cain and his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And he got angry. God, I guess, you're right. He wasn't happy. A religious man. He went to great effort to worship God, but of course he wasn't worshiping God according to truth, according to what God had commanded to be worshipped, or how God had commanded him to worship. See, God wasn't a respecter of persons. God had respect to Abel because Abel did right. Verse 6, and the Lord said to Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Interesting, isn't it? The language here. Let's go back and notice this. Why are you mad, Cain? Verse 6. If you did well, you know God would accept your sacrifice. God isn't hard to please. And if you don't do well, sin lies at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. You know, when Cain and Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, again, remember the picture. We have an angel, or at least in the New Testament. I mean, this is figurative, a vision of what spiritual things could look like if we saw them. We have an angel on the right side of our brain, a little devil's angel on the left side of our brain. And maybe that's what he's talking about here is this fight over good and evil. You know, we've got to fight the sin inside of us. When we're tempted, we've got to win that battle. Verse 8. And Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. Now it seems as there's other combatants in the battle over good and evil for Cain, right? His brother got involved. Maybe his brother's angel, the good side of Abel. Maybe he told Cain, what he ought to do, or what he would have done, or why he did what he did. But Cain got angry at Abel. Now it's interesting because he shouldn't have been mad at Abel. He should have been mad at himself. There's nobody that can separate us from the love of God except for ourselves. And Abel hopefully had the sense, not to be provoking Cain. But Cain blamed Abel somehow. Interesting, isn't it? It's almost as if his bad side has taken on the good side of himself and Abel. And the Lord said to Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? He is his own. Certainly. And he didn't do that well. But of course, he's not his brother's keeper, but he should be his protector. He should have not have murdered him, of course. Again, this reminds us of Genesis 3, when God says to Adam and Eve in the garden, where art thou? God knew where they were, and God knew where Abel was. He was testing Cain. And Cain, of course, dug himself in deeper. Of course, he'd murdered a man, and it wasn't going to end first murder. And he said, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Again, of course, figurative, right? God knew what happened. From the ground, is there part of a spiritual part of was his brother in Hades, in paradise, and did he call out from the ground? Maybe. I mean, certainly God would hear him. Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. Remember, even the rich man called the Abraham. He got some information indirectly, at least, from God. The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Verse 11, and now art thou cursed from the earth, which has opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Okay, I mean, the ground was already harder to till, wasn't there? Already stickers and other problems because of this battle over good and evil in our minds. And it's complicated that even further. Interesting how this ties together, I think, in this great battle from Adam and Eve, knowing good and evil, and how they were cast out of the garden, how the ground was affected. Now it's affected even more. Verse 12, and when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be on the earth. Now this is of course is interesting in that we've already seen earlier about the Garden of Eden being talked about, how that it was, apparently a pretty good place, the rivers that ran out of it. And now we see the other lands around about it. They aren't in the Garden of Eden, but now, time is going on, and they're in a big world. Probably it's, all the earth is there together in one place. There's probably not oceans separating lands, and they're populating the earth. And here are these first brothers. Did they have sisters? Yes, that's who they married. Remember that in the beginning, more ancient, more perfect is what Brother Roy Deaver used to tell us and talk about. Of course, the genetic pool, genetics were perfect then, and so a reason why we don't want brothers to marry sisters today is because the genetic pool is not that pure, it's not that perfect, and certainly we don't have a need to. We don't want that kind of thing in our families. But in that day and time, of course, it was acceptable. Remember, Adam and Eve are going to live to be. Adam's going to be 900 years old, 930 years old when he dies. So Adam and Eve probably had a lot of children. If women lived longer than men back then, Eve could have lived to be 1,000. The oldest man we know was Methuselah, 969 years old, and he probably died when the flood came. But he's only the oldest one that's listed in the Bible, and there are very few listed because the earth was quickly being populated at this point in time. And Cain and Able, of course, Cain was the first, and that's really the significance of mention here because of the seed promise and how he's going to lose his position in the seed promise. In other words, Christ is not going to come through him because of this sin. Anyway, he's cursed from the earth. Down to verse 12. He's going to till the ground. It's not going to work. Verse 13, and Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. I can't deal with it. We don't know how many people there were when this was happening, when this was occurring. Could have been a lot, couldn't there? But he was concerned because people would know who he was already, right? And he committed this murder, and what an awful thing. He was caught for this murder, and he had a lot of brothers and sisters that wouldn't like it very well. Of course, they would want to take vengeance upon him. So my punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that every one that findeth me shall slay me. Again, I assume, of course, here that everyone knew about Cain. He was talked about, and the whole earth knew about him, and they talked about him. If anybody found him, he knew people would find him and that he would be killed. Verse 16, Cain went out of the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod. I'm sorry, I skipped an important verse. Verse 15, the Lord said unto him, therefore, whosoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Now, Cain already knew people would find him. And God knows that people would find him. And so this mark that God put on Cain is not going to be one that identifies Cain. This mark is going to be a marking that identifies God's protection upon Cain. In fact, it may not have been a mark at all that people could see. It might have been a tattoo on his right shoulder. He wore a shirt. People may have never seen it. I mean, we don't know. But he was marked by God so that people would not hurt him. I think the key for us to remember here is a lot of people, when they look to the Bible, they talk about this mark of Cain. People have all kinds of weird and perverse ideas about it. The whole world already knew who Cain was. And the mark was so that the one they knew who was wouldn't be killed. And it's even possible that God didn't put a literal mark on him, that he was a marked man by God. God marked him. God knew this about him. God marked him so that nobody else would harm him. And, the marking may have been God's word that was spread right here. The writing of God's word. The people were not to hurt him. Let's see. Let's look at this word again. Upon Cain, it could have been on Cain, a mark on Cain, a mark about Cain. So it's interesting. Again, my biggest point here would be to not make too big of a deal about it, because the significance was for people in that day and time not to kill the man. Why? Again, God was populating the earth. God wanted to protect him. This probably the firstborn child on the earth. Verse 17, and Cain knew his wife, and she conceived. Again, who's his wife? His sister. She conceived and bare Enoch, and he builded a city. You see, the world's populating pretty fast. Builded a city. Called the name of that city after the name of his son Enoch. So Cain built a city with his wife and his family, and they called the city Enoch. And Enoch was born Irad, and Irad beget Mahaziel, and Mahaziel beget Methuselah, and Methuselah beget Lamech. Now you remember Methuselah. He was the old man that died in the flood. Probably he either died in the flood, or the flood came when he died, or he died in the flood. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of the one was Adai, and the name of the other Zilai. And Adai bare Jabal. He was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. I don't have markings on this Bible. Again, we don't know how necessarily they were pronounced anyway. Brother's name was Jabal, and the father of all such as handle a harp and organ. It's interesting, verse 21 again. Remember that Adam and Eve had a miraculous education. I say that even Satan had a miraculous education. They knew things, before they learned them. They didn't have parents. Adam and Eve's parents were God. Now they had a pretty significant education. It seems as if it would include harps and organs. Adam and Eve may have taught their children about harps and organs. They may have been walking encyclopedias. Adam was able to name all the animals. But anyway, they knew how to build cities. There were no such thing as cavemen, were there? Harps and organs. In Zillah she bore tablet Cain, and instruct of every artificer in brass and iron. Okay, you talking about beating brass and iron. They knew these things already in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible in the sense of time-wise, though the book of Job is the oldest book in the Bible. And the sister of Tablet, Cain, and Namrah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adai and Zillah, Hear my voice, you wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech. For I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Well, what does this mean to us? People believe God. They believe God's word. At that point in time, people were listening to God. Now, verse 25. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, she said, she hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. I'm not sure if she knew the significance here, but this was a replacement for Abel, Seth. And this was a replacement for the seed line that you read about how Christ enters into the world. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. And so again, they were in and out of being faithful to God. This was a time when the world was growing, and it's interesting, I think, to consider their relationship with God, because they could go and talk to Adam and Eve, and they could talk about these things that happened in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden. It was still there, right? It was still being marked. And so men should have had a closer relationship with God, but of course they were in and out. And now we have this picture where we're seeing how that the seed line is starting to be talked about. The great purpose of the Bible in the book of Genesis is to show us Christ is coming to this world. Genesis chapter 4. Thanks for joining us.